Hello everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to present to you today. Just a quick recap on some typical examples of active medical devices. So an active medical device is one which is electrically powered, and in this day and age will almost invariably include a microcontroller or computer of some sort. So just on the screen are a few examples of devices that Genesys has worked on over the years. We have a lot of other new and exciting projects that we're working on that unfortunately are restrained by confidentiality constraints, and so hence we really can't talk about them. And today's example, as Tim mentioned, it is a theoretical example, but it actually draws upon a real device, and we use that as an example so we can avoid any commercial and confidence constraints. I previously spoke about ISO 14971 and risk management at a higher level, jointly with Sue Lynch a while back, but didn't really get down under the hood of how you go about actually doing risk control and hazard analysis process. So today I'll be delving quite deeply into that. So I'll be moving fairly quickly through the initial introductory information so that we can get down under the hood and actually work through a worked example. And as usual, I'll be looking for Tim to sort of interject at appropriate points to ask clarifying questions or to have a little bit more dialogue rather than just a cold presentation of information on slides. So bottom line is, what's ISO 14971 trying to achieve by the risk management process? And the headline item is to achieve safety in the use of the device, so the device doesn't cause injury or damage to anybody and actually does the job it's supposed to do, therefore providing the therapeutic benefit to the patient. So that's the end objective. So the process is holistic in that it's a life cycle management process from the start of the planning through to the end of delivery and maintenance of the product in the field. Risk management is a core activity throughout the entire process. And to be able to comply with the regulatory standards in relation to 14971, the whole process must be managed and documented and recorded. Now, to put into context what risk management is all about, there are some key definitions that we need to look at, and these occur in ISO 13485 and are replicated in 14971 in identical or similar form. And you'll find other documents that use these same definitions with some minor variations, but to all intents and purposes, they actually are harmonized across all the standards. So I've just put a few slides up with the definitions extracted from the standard, verbatim, and then just a bit of commentary on what they actually mean. So what is risk? Essentially, risk is the end result of a hazard, and a hazard is something that can cause harm. So the end result of the risk is how likely is that hazard to eventuate and to then cause harm. And we'll look under the hood about what that actually means in the next few slides. But essentially, a hazard can potentially cause a harm, but will not necessarily cause a harm. So by way of example, electric shock. We're all familiar with electric shock causes electrocution. Well, actually, the vast majority of electric shocks don't cause electrocution. In fact, many shocks, even from main sources, will cause nothing more than mild discomfort. But you can cause a range of disorders, from burns to unpleasant feelings to muscle spasms and injury, right through to permanent injury or death. And interestingly, when you look at the statistics for death caused by electric shock, it tends to be caused by secondary effect as much as by the electricity flow itself. So people suffer a shock and then can fall off a ladder and be killed or injured, or they can entangle themselves in machinery as a byproduct of the electric shock. But the point to take away is that the hazard is the hazardous situation is exposure to electric current flow. So the hazardous situation is that current flow occurs, and then the harm is the outcomes of that. So we get to risk management, and I've once again got the definition up there. but it essentially means a process by which you identify risks, you then analyze those risks and determine their probability of occurrence and their severity, and then grade those risks, and then determine methods by which those risks can be minimized or mitigated, with the end objective of ensuring that we have reduced risk to an acceptable level. What's an acceptable level? That's something to be determined by the manufacturer. We'll look at that in a subsequent slide. In cases where risk cannot be reduced to an acceptable level, but there is still benefit in using the device, you can undertake a benefit risk analysis to show that the risk is worth the benefits provided by the device. So risk analysis gets down deeper, and another term for this is hazards analysis, but it effectively is a systematic process of identifying hazards and then estimating the risk arising from those hazards. So how do we go about doing this? Firstly, we need to identify the hazards, and in order to do that, we have to say, well, what harm can be caused? So there is a linkage between the hazardous situation and the harm it can cause, but bottom line is anything that can cause harm to the patient, the operator, or the environment ultimately arises from hazardous situations. So hazardous situations are a sequence of events, and a good example of this, aeroplanes don't normally crash just because one thing happens. Normally a whole heap of things happen in sequence for the aeroplane to crash. So a fault occurs, and then the pilots react in a manner, and then the result of the pilot reaction leads to something, and so forth and so forth. In a worst case scenario, the aeroplane crashes, but the vast majority of things that go awry on our aircraft do not cause it to crash. So in order to do this systematic...
One of the things that really strikes me about that is that, a lot of the people in this audience are technology focused people.
Sorry, Tim, you just dropped out then.
Sorry, somehow my mute activated itself without me touching anything. Is that any kind of risk is always a combination of technical factors and sociological factors. And so I know there's this field of usability, and we're talking about hazards analysis today, and to a certain extent that can be looking at the technical aspects of it, as you mentioned, electrocution, but there's always a human factor involved, isn't there? And
yeah, absolutely, and we'll actually explore that when we go through the worked example. And you mentioned the usability is a particularly good focus point for that, because the 6366 usability engineering is very heavily focused on identifying and assessing and minimizing risk. It's very risk focused.
So is there an overlap then in the tasks and activities you do between that standard and this one?
Oh, absolutely, and you will find usability related risks are identified during your risk management process, and really where the usability standard comes in is it drives particular focus down that pathway to identify risks of a particular type, i.e. associated with user behavior, and what the consequences of those risks are. Another good example of that is IEC 60601-1 throughout the standard identifies hazardous situations and risks that are particularly pertinent to particular characteristics of the equipment and the need to deal with those in the risk management process. So you can look at the risk management process as a focus of all these things. They all come together under the banner of risk management and hazards analysis in all of those different categories of risk.
So is there a particular, is it just one unified process, or should the usability piece be done in parallel or separately, or before or after?
Yeah, it should really be done in parallel, and in the early stages is actually an integral part. And the same it goes for the electrical hazards, the same it goes for software hazards. They all start with what is ultimately the harm that can be caused, and what are the sequences of events leading to those harms, And those sequences of events include the usability aspect, the electrical safety considerations, software as a contributor to hazards, etc., etc. So it's really a good view to have is that the risk management process is all encompassing, but the focus on particular areas can be brought to bear by looking at those specific standards that relate to those different aspects of the device.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, so back to the slide. So the overall risk analysis process is a process of identifying harms and the severity of harms. In other words, how bad is the outcome for the patient or the operator? What are the hazards and sequences of events that can lead to a situation that can cause the harm to occur? What is the probability of that sequence of events occurring and therefore the hazardous situation materializing? What is in turn the risk of that hazardous situation actually causing harm, because it's not guaranteed that it will? And the overall risk is a combination of those probabilities and severity to be able to rank individual risks by category and also by their relative severity, and then decide what to do about them. So looking at a little more detail at the definition, we've already talked about what a hazard is, but it's essentially it's the thing that can cause a situation to materialize that can potentially cause harm. So a good example, exposed electrical wires carrying potentially lethal voltages, obviously has a situation, something that can cause infection or toxins, sharp objects. Good example I like to use is a scalpel. It's inherently a dangerous device with substantial risk associated with it. Mechanical entrapment, etc. So there's a whole range of things that are in fact hazards that can potentially lead to harm. So hazardous situation, and sorry, this gets a little bit repetitive, but I think it's important to follow through the chain to see the logic in these definitions. So a hazardous situation is essentially something that occurs that can cause a hazard to be evident that can potentially cause harm. So the example, falling back to the electrical one, you pull on an electrical cable, retaining mechanism breaks. That may cause exposure of wiring. It may not cause exposure of wiring. It's not guaranteed that it will, but it's relatively likely it might. What can then happen? The patient or the operator can contact those wires directly via another electrical conductive item and cause electric current to flow. So each of those things must occur before the hazardous situation occurs. Then for harm to occur, it must actually result in that current flow. So just having an exposed wire that someone notices and turns the power off means that you've averted the harm because you've actually nullified the hazard by your actions. So it gets quite complicated to link these sequences of events that lead to hazards and what the probability of harm actually occurring. And that's the justification for having a formal analysis, is to do that in a structured and orderly manner to end up with a credible result. So looking a little more deeply at harm, the definition's pretty straightforward, something that can damage health of people, and that is predominantly the patient, but also includes operators and bystanders, but also taking into account damage to property or the environment, for example, something that might be a chemical hazard is a good example of that. So essentially harm is someone is injured is the primary harm we're concerned with, but also damage to property or environment are also taken into account. So the harm in the electrical case is someone's exposed to the mains voltage and it causes electrocution, which may cause death. So looking at harms, we need to consider severity levels, and the table that I've reproduced there is extracted from one of the annexes of 14971. And these categorizations are not mandatory. You can choose whichever ones you think are appropriate, but it's a pretty firm bit of advice to follow something that can be traced back to the standard or to essentially, it's not an annex of 14971 and a new issue, it's a technical report, but something that's actually got credibility that regulators will recognize as a pretty good starting point. So we can rate it from the obvious, catastrophic or fatal that can result in death, criticals, permanent or irreversible injury, down to something that's negligible that might be inconvenience or temporary discomfort, and a graduation in between. So having a look at the risk management process in 14971, I won't labour over this, but I've just reproduced a flowchart and the table of contents just to show the sequence of events and the orderly process that we follow. So sequence is firstly analyse the risk by identifying the harms and the hazards and the probabilities to come up with a sensible quantitative value for the likelihood of that risk arising and its severity. We then evaluate that risk to say, is that risk acceptable or not? And in cases where the risk is deemed unacceptable, we can then implement risk control measures essentially to reduce the risk. After we've implemented those measures, we then reevaluate what the risk is after those measures are in effect and determine if that residual risk is acceptable or not. We then review the overall outcome and determine whether we have reduced risk to an acceptable level, or whether we need to iterate around the process to reduce risk further, or whether we need to do a risk-benefit analysis because we can't reduce the risk anymore, but the device is still worthwhile because of the benefits it provides.
So Geoff, can I just ask, going back to your example of the electrical cord that you could pull out and expose a wire, and you may say, well, there's a risk of that happening of a certain percentage, and therefore you put in place your risk controls, which might be, well, we're going to install a retaining mechanism to make sure that it can't come out in some way. When you do your risk analysis right at the start, and you're designing a product, presumably if you're a reasonably good designer, your initial design would already have the retaining mechanism in it. So are you doing a risk analysis on the design with the safety feature already in place, or do you sort of pretend that the safety feature is not there and then add it in afterwards?
A slightly cynical view is it's really good to have recognize a large number of risks and then have effective measures in place to deal with them. So if you follow that trajectory, you will actually do the initial risk assessment if the management or control measure were not in place, and then you do your residual risk after risk control with the measurements in place. And that is generally the approach I follow. I don't presume that I've got a whole heap of design measures that I know I've put in there as an engineer to control risk. I don't presume that. I identify the risks without the control measure, then identify the control measure, even though I knew from day one I was going to put it in there. And that avoids a problem of having to make a decision about do you put it in or not in the initial assessment. And of course, when you're doing this risk analysis process, I would like to think I embark upon it knowing that I've got 95% of the risk control measures in place before I've even thought about what the risk is. So I just know what the risks are, and I put those in as a matter of course, knowing that they will arise during the analysis, knowing I'll have to deal with them. Others, of course, crop up out of left field that you hadn't thought about that you do need to deal with, and particular things that are very specific to the product rather than quite generic. So it's a kind of roundabout answer. So it's a little bit of both, but I think you err on the side of putting in the raw risk without any control measure and then identifying the control measure by the type of measure you're putting in place. And we'll look at the detail of that on a subsequent slide. Just to finish off on this slide, it is important to note that this process continues throughout the entire life cycle of the product after it's deployed in the field. So any issues occurring with deployed devices, faults or adverse events need to have risk reconsidered. In fact, to the extent that you may identify a new sequence of events or a new hazard that you hadn't thought about in your risk analysis process initially, and you have to recycle back and incorporate that one after that new hazard becomes known. So in terms of how we go about doing this, and this is the flow chart on the left is once again an extract from the standard, and it's a pretty useful document, and we'll look at the concepts of that in some subsequent slides. So essentially we have harm severity rankings that we talked about, and we have a probability of harm occurring, and you have to relate that to a time scale. So it can be per use of the device, particularly if it's a single-use device, or per device per year, or per device throughout its life cycle. But you need to relate the probability of occurrence of harm to some timescale. I think the per device per year is a fairly reasonable one. And the risk evaluation matrix actually takes a score, takes the harm, probability of harm and the harm severity. You can see those in the rows and the columns, and where those columns intersect, puts a judgment value about acceptability. So we're saying if we have a probability of harm of 3, which is occasional, and a severity level of 4, which is critical, the intersection gives a non-acceptable level of risk. There are other variants of this matrix where some of the intersections on the margin become yellow, which is marginally acceptable, but bottom line is you need to have some degree of ranking risk. Also, you should take into account that regardless of risk ranking, you should always try and reduce risk further if that is possible. So you may come up with many green ones that are right down in a low category, and you'll choose to say, well, I will still introduce a risk reduction measure on that. And particularly if you've got a risk reduction measure that's easy, you do that, and the regulators are never going to penalise you for being over compliant. So having a look at the left, you'll note the flow. We go from hazard, sequence of events giving rise to the hazardous situation, leading to harm. And there are 2 probabilities identified, which I'll talk about in a following slide. So P1 is the probability of the hazardous situation occurring. So does that sequence of events lead to the hazard arising? P2 is if the hazard arises, will that actually cause harm? Because many hazardous situations will not cause harm. For example, someone may notice that the hazardous situation has arisen and they'll rectify it before harm actually occurs. So getting your head around the concept of those 2 different probabilities leading to the ultimate probability of harm is quite important. So I'll skip through this pretty quickly. So P1 is the probability. What is the probability of the sequence of events leading to the hazardous situation occurs? So using my example, excessive force is put on the cable retaining mechanism breaks, the cable splits, and the wires, electrical conductors, are exposed. All those things must occur before the hazardous situation actually arises. So you have to try and estimate what is the probability of all those things happening in a real world usage scenario. It's very important to note you can't just dream these probabilities up out of the blue. You really need to support them, preferably by objective evidence, so some documented evidence from prior experience or studies that have been done, and that's often quite difficult. Failing that, you need to at least have a justified and reasoned argument presented by an expert to say this estimate of probability is reasonable because of the following, and then justify that your probability isn't just a guess that you've plucked out of the air. So looking at P2, so let's say the hazardous situation has arisen. If that hazardous situation arises, what's the likelihood of harm? So we have our exposed wires. What is the likelihood that someone will actually touch those wires directly or indirectly and cause excessive electric current to flow, therefore potentially causing harm to the patient? And so we have to say, what is the probability that that harm will occur? And we talked about severity of harm. It's possible that, in fact, likely that different hazardous situations can give rise to different levels of harm with different probabilities. So your electrical wires may cause a mild electric shock with a certain probability. They may cause a substantial electric shock causing muscle spasm with a higher level of probability, and may cause death with a lower level of probability. So you might need to split out when estimating the risk to those different harm outcomes for a given hazardous situation. Once again, we need to justify our probabilities with a reasoned argument. So at the end of the day, we end up with the probability of harm is P1, P2. So the statistical experts amongst us will know that that's assuming that they're independent probabilities, that one doesn't affect the other. But it's a pretty reasonable estimate for most hazardous situations. So therefore, we end up with this score, P1 times P2 is the overall probability score of the hazardous situation arising causing harm. And just a note, if it's a catastrophic event, even though it's extremely rare and unlikely to occur, it will still accrue a high risk score, which means you should do something to reduce the risk, even if its probability of occurrence is extremely low. So the level of risk combines the probability ranking and the harm ranking to come up with a risk score. And as per the earlier slide and the example I'll be showing, that's just a numerical value which you ascribe to the risk, and then you assess, is that risk acceptable? Which gives rise to the $64 question, what is an acceptable level of risk? Well, slightly perversely, that is for the manufacturer to determine. So you decide what risk score is acceptable and what risk score is not acceptable. So that's obviously open to a lot of consideration and interpretation, but the bottom line is to get past the regulators, you must have a realistic assessment of what level of risk is acceptable. And generally, the only acceptable risks are low probability events with relatively low outcomes, or incredibly unlikely events with severe outcomes. You can't really say that you have an arbitrary number and just set that so that all of your risks suddenly become acceptable. And in any case, you should take all the steps you can to reduce risk to as low a level as possible. We'll have a quick look at that in a minute. So once we've determined we have risks and assessed their acceptability and decided we need to reduce the risks, how do we go about doing that? The first recourse is inherent safety by design. In other words, you design your device so that you inherently make it safe. And one way of achieving this is to comply with IEC 60601-1 and all of the requirements that it defines. That is an example of inherent safety by design by standards compliance, and complying with 6304 for software is another. The next step is protective measures. So we add in something additional to reduce the risk. So a really good example of that in the electrical case is you might say, well, one level of insulation in the cable that's reasonably fragile is inadequate to reduce the risk. Therefore, we will use a double insulated cable with an armored jacket. So we greatly reduce the risk that that cable will fail and expose the electrical conductors. So that's effectively a protective measure. A microcontroller watchdog for your software, which causes software reset if the software locks up, is another protective measure. And there's a whole range of them in the different categories of function of the device. And the last recourse is information for safety. So something that you put in your user instructions to, for example, to warn the user not to do something. This becomes a little bit problematic if you rely on it too much, because you then fall foul of your usability if there is still a risk that the user might not follow those instructions properly. So probably information for safety is your sort of last recourse in terms of reducing risk.
But Geoff, there would be certain situations like that scalpel example you alluded to earlier, where you would actually destroy the utility of the device if you reduce the risk beyond a certain level.
That's correct. So therefore, user instructions: do not cut yourself with a scalpel, and risk-benefit analysis. There is a risk that you'll cut yourself and cause infection, etc. However, without a scalpel, you can't perform surgery. So the benefit is that scalpels enable surgery to be performed. So that's a pretty tried example, but it's a good example of the sort of pathway you can follow. The question is, how low is low enough? Well, this brings about a dilemma. The FDA used to recognize as far as possible, or as far as reasonably possible. Got that wrong. As low as reasonably practical, LARP, whereas the EU has replaced that by as far as possible. So as low as reasonably practical means you reduce risk to a sensibly low level based on practical, economically feasible approach, whereas the EU has said, regardless of costs, you must reduce risk as far as possible. Any engineer will tell you that that's really not practical. For example, I could say I'm in surgery and there's a risk that the surgeon might faint, therefore I have a second surgeon on standby. A second surgeon might trip over the cord and knock his skull, and so both surgeons are disabled. Do I have a third surgeon on standby? So how far do you go? And the answer is there's no end point. So you can't take this AFAP as far as practical literally. So that gives rise to a dilemma in terms of the European regulations, but I'm not going to labour on that point. Very important thing to note is the extract from 60601-1, which is a really useful indicator. So where this standard or its collateral standards, that means just about every other technical standard you're going to come across. Identify a hazard or hazardous situation and specific acceptance criteria based on the tests in 60601-1. If you comply with 60601-1 for that particular aspect, then you are deemed to have reduced risk to a low enough level unless there's objective evidence to the contrary. So this reverses the burden of proof. Normally you'll say, I comply with 60601-1 in respect of that clause, therefore I have reduced risk to a low enough level, and it's a pretty extraordinary circumstance where that won't hold true. So it's important to bear in mind that that's a really good indicator when you're trying to make this decision about how low to reduce risk. I haven't actually encountered the circumstance where that gets challenged by this AFAP requirement, but I mean, that could well happen in time. So my personal approach is to rely fairly heavily on that 60601-1 definition. Okie doke. So from that, we'll jump into our example. I've left myself enough time, I think. So Tim, any sort of points of wrap up on what I've talked about so far?
No, as usual, Geoff, you've done a very thorough job of it. And it looks all very daunting when you look at all these words. So I'm looking forward to your example to show how this can actually be applied.
Yeah. So it's a little bit like climbing Mount Everest. It's quite easy if you just do it one step at a time.
And I might just share with the audience that Geoff is actually a guest lecturer at the University of Newcastle, where he's using these worked examples to educate some students there. So we're gaining the benefit of that.
The example I'm going to present is for a respiratory ventilator. I'm going to go through a simplified process. So the risk analysis matrix I'll be showing you is relatively simplified, and I won't actually be presenting justifications of probability assessments and so forth. So it is a somewhat theoretical example, but it does draw upon information. Medtronic made all of the information available about their ventilator on the web. Their hazards analysis table had over 1,000 line items in it. I have drawn on that a little bit in terms of identifying harms that can be caused by a ventilator, but I'm actually presenting examples of hazardous situations that are practical, real world, that are very similar. A lot of them are very similar for devices of a wide range of types. So although it's a theoretical example, it's a pretty good indicator of how you can go about the process. So we're talking about a ventilator for use in typically an intensive care hospital environment, a highly critical device where the picture shows an intubated patient. If that ventilator fails, that patient will most likely die unless some intervention is undertaken. So it's a critical life support system. There are other uses of the same device where there's a mask providing supplemental oxygen, where failure of the device is not so catastrophic for the patient, but nevertheless can be harmful to them. And so the little graph just shows that these ventilators, they control the important parameters to control are the pressure throughout the inhalation exhalation waveform, the volume of gas which is exchanged, in other words, oxygenated air in, stale air out, and also the rate of flow. And in particular, the pressure is important. It's really critical to not over-pressurize the lungs of someone who has a major condition such as COVID, or you can destroy their lungs by applying excessive pressure. And obviously the volume is important in terms of maintaining oxygen levels. So that's our example. So we need to have a look to be able to do a hazard analysis is what's the intended use of the device. So we need to set the scene for the environment where the device is used. So I won't read out what's on the screen, but essentially it's to provide different methods of ventilation support for the patient, ranging from masks, just giving supplementary oxygen, through to intubated, giving full breathing control of the patient so they can't breathe without the machine doing it for them. And incidentally, there is a higher level of support where it's like a machine where the blood is oxygenated externally. But these devices, ventilators, actually use the patient's lungs to do the oxygenation in a normal manner. So we have different modes of operation and different things to control in those modes of operation. So the intended use is absolutely critical to define. So in this case, it's as a medical device by qualified trained personnel in a hospital or clinic environment. And this is separated out from ventilators that might be used in a home use environment, for example. So this does determine who are the users of the device and what sort of training level can we expect of them. So the use environments in hospital intensive care and emergency departments, so where there will be an abundance of trained personnel, hopefully, and there'll also be other equipment for monitoring the patient. So this is contrast to, say, a ventilator for use in a home environment. And we need to say what is the limitations on the patient population. So this is not suitable for use. And this is from the Medtronic thing on small, sort of young children or babies, because it's the levels of ventilation it provides can be damaging to them. So this gets to the indicators for use, and the instructions for use: don't use on people under 11 pounds, 5 kilograms. So this sets the scene for how we, at the very high level, about how we go about determining what the environment of use of the device is and the operator skills, etc., etc. And of course, you can extend this out to the full user requirement specification comes into play. But these are the key elements that you need to consider. So what does the ventilator have to do? Well, it has to provide continual respiratory ventilation support that meets the requirements of the doctor, who will prescribe the method and type of treatment, whether it's a mask with supplemental oxygen or intubation, and what method of support is provided, whether it's just assistance to the breathing or whether it totally takes over the breathing. And so obviously within that context, the ventilator must be safe, must be used within its applicable regulatory compliance definition, and must do the job that it's intended to do. So just quickly having a look at harms, we need to determine what are potential harms that the ventilator can cause, and it's generally not possible to consider harms in isolation from causes, but we just have a high level statement of the cause and what the harm that can arise. So there's just a few examples shown on here from a pretty low severity situation. Someone's going to have a ventilator put on them in a hospital. Well, most people are going to suffer anxiety when that occurs. And it's just a natural part of the human condition. But that anxiety for most people is not going to be particularly severe and can be easily dealt with. Or you can argue that it is what it is and you might be anxious, but this is going to save your life, so get over it. Then we look at distress. So if the ventilator, an example, the ventilator is working and something goes wrong and it temporarily stops ventilating, the person using it might be distressed because they know the machine stopped, or they might start to suffer some relatively minor symptoms such as temporary shortness of breath, but the nursing staff can quickly deal with the situation, get it running again. So therefore the severity of harm at the distress level is not particularly severe. Up to the next level, where you've got the ventilator settings incorrectly set and the patient deteriorates significantly, and that's not picked up by the physician. So you might actually be causing potential long-term or significant deterioration of the patient's condition that will need interventions. Then we go through to major situations. For example, the oxygen supply is cut off, or the ventilator fails and needs to be replaced. So therefore the patient might be in a great deal of difficulty after that occurs. I've put a couple on there that are not related to the actual patient. So say you've got electromagnetic compatibility problem and this ventilator starts to interfere with other life support systems in its environment. So it could be a very severe impact if this device causes other life critical support functions to be denied to the patient. And obviously infections, if you get contamination when the patient's having the device applied to them and cause infection. That could lead to a serious outcome for the patient. And then death, obviously failure of the device to do its job can potentially cause the patient's death, or we can electrocute the patient or the operator by the device having a major failure. So that's just an example of the sort of harms that you are looking for, and the standards do have some guidance on that, and I've added a couple of slides at the end that we probably won't have time to get to, giving some of that guidance. You should try and reduce the number of identified harms to a minimum. If you have dozens of them, you're going to have a great degree of difficulty in determining their severity and ranking their probabilities of occurrence. So it's best to try and reduce the harms to sort of generic, a small number of generic types of harm, and then relate that to a whole heap of different situations that can cause that harm, rather than having every sequence of events leading to a different harm. It just becomes totally unmanageable. So my rule of thumb is to try and reduce it to, if you can keep it under 10, it's great, but maybe 20 is sort of sometimes needed in terms of having adequate coverage of all the possible outcomes that can eventuate. So that leads us to the fun part, which is the risk assessment process, or risk analysis / hazards analysis, and how we go about doing that. And the method shown here is one of a number of methods, but it's the usual one that's applied to medical devices. It's called a risk matrix. It's a form of failure modes, criticality and effect analysis. It uses the same methodology, but it is applied specifically to risks as defined in the medical standard. There are other methods, fault tree analysis and critical hazardous operations, so forth and so forth, that are used for risk management in various domains. I'm guessing they could be used, but I haven't actually done anything other than this approach. So this is the standard approach that I've used, the standard approach we use at Genesys. So on that, move that over to, so Tim, can you see a spreadsheet?
Yes, I can, Geoff.
Good. Is that legible, that size, or do I need to? Oh, that's not the spreadsheet I want. That's the one I want.
It looks reasonably good for me, yeah. Or even better.
Okay, so I'll just zoom out for a sec and show you the overall extent of this, because I will need to zoom in to be able to show you the detail.
I've just got a question from the audience while you're setting that up, Geoff. And the question is, for the case of a non-medical device, i.e. laboratory analysis equipment, for example, where the device is handling hazardous medicines, cytotoxic oncology drugs, for example, what compliance requirements are there for a device developer needs to comply with?
The regulatory standard in that case is 61010, I think it is. It's the laboratory, it's a confusing number. It's the equivalent of 60601, but applied to laboratory equipment. And so it's focused much more heavily on the operator and the user of that equipment rather than the patient. But you'll find the electrical safety standards align with the safety standards that apply to your normal commercial equipment like your laptop computer. But there are then obviously all the hazards that relate to the potential function of that device that can cause hazard to the operator. So it's the safety of laboratory equipment. But in principle, it's very similar to 60601-1 in many aspects, but it doesn't have the patient flavor to it.
Yeah, and it really depends a little bit on how the device is being used, whether it's for research purposes, in which case, you know, the issues are not nearly so high. But if it's a lot of laboratory equipment is actually used in the processing of pharmaceuticals or biologicals in order to have an end product. And in that case, it actually falls under good manufacturing practice.
Yeah, the biological thing, biological treatments has its whole set of standards. One thing that is interesting if you're if you've got autologous cell treatments or autologous treatments where you're harvesting material from the patient, modifying it and then re-injecting it into the patient, that is treated by the TGA as a medical device class 2. So it's coming into contact with the patient because the patient's cells end up in the device and those cells are going to be put back in the patient. So that's a unusual example, but the general principle is that the pharmaceuticals has got their whole GMP standards and the laboratory devices have their whole standards. But there's nothing to stop you applying 60601-1 in that case, if in doubt. But it's certainly beneficial, but it may not be sufficient. There may be additional things to comply with, and particularly the hazardous toxic chemicals. I'm not really familiar with the appropriate standards for that. I have had a quick look at it, but it's not really clear cut for the occupational health and safety aspect of chemical handling. So that gives us a big picture overview of this, but unreadable. But you'll see at the top, I've got the probability of harm and the harm severity and the risk evaluation just there as an aide-memoire. And I'll now zoom in a bit so we can see. So is that reasonably legible at that level, Tim?
Yes, sorry, I'm just correcting something. I just sent the link very unhelpfully, the wrong one. It's 61010 is the
61010, yeah.
61010 is the laboratory. It's so annoying because I just sent a very helpful link and accidentally sent it to 60601-1. So, but yeah, it's 61010.
Yeah. So what I'm showing here is just I've got a few worked examples, and we can do as many of these as the audience has got appetite and time for, but I'll definitely do a couple of them to show you just the flavor of the approach to the problem. So this is a structured form of analysis, so identify all the hazards, and for a ventilator, as I mentioned, the Medtronic one had 1,000 line items. For a moderately complicated device that includes software, you should expect to have at least 200 or 300 line items in this table as a reasonable sort of benchmark. You don't want to go totally over the top, but you don't want to go too short either. So this is a simplified table, so it doesn't include all of the detail that we would normally look at, but it gives the enough information to indicate how you go about the process. So we say, what is the class of hazard? So you see I've got function, patient state of mind, biohazard exposure. So just a sort of a one-liner or a short description of the nature of the hazard. And we say, well, what is the sequence of events that we're dealing with? What is the hazardous situation arising for those sequence of events, and what is the harm that can result? So by way of an example, hazardous situation, loss of ventilation support to the patient, and in this case I've chosen an extreme one. So the ventilator denies the patient ventilation support, the patient's critically ill, they're denied ventilation for 5 minutes, which is my arbitrary number, leading to patient death. So what sequence of events causes that to happen? Patients intubated in ICU and dependent upon the ventilator for their ventilation support to live. The device fails, so ceases to provide ventilation, and the ICU's intensive care unit staff don't notice that that's occurred, don't take any action, and the patient dies as a consequence. So I've put in the notes just some justification of why we might think that the probability of this event is reasonable, as I've put in. So I've put, say, these are intended to be highly reliable devices and they'll be verified for that reliability. So made a judgment, one in 10 devices may fail in a 1 year period. That would need to be justified by other information than just a bland statement like that. So there would need to be some analysis behind that. But that's the ultimate basis on which that probability has been determined. Once again, we say the ICU staff. I've said 1 in 10 incidences, the ICU staff will fail to take action and do something to save the patient. Now that's probably a very pessimistic estimate for what happens in reality, but it's better to put in a high probability if in doubt. So in this instance, we end up with a probability P1 by P2 of 100. So we check that up and we say that 1 in 100 is a frequent event. It gets a rank of 5, and the severity rank is death, which is a rank of 5. So that maxes out our risk score. So that risk is clearly not acceptable. So we need to do something about it. So what do we do about it? Having evaluated a risk and said it's not acceptable, let's see if I can get that to go where I want it to go. We then have to do something about risk control. And we have these options, recall: inherent safety by design, protective measures or information for safety. And I've just put some notes about rationale. So one thing we know, that fitting of alarms to equipment is standard practice for critical care equipment. And normally in an intensive care unit, someone who's on a ventilator will have a second bit of equipment on there monitoring their vital signs, and that will have their alarms fitted. So we have an idea on how we might go about reducing the risk. So to formalise that, firstly we say inherent safety by design. So the device conforms with 60601-1. So that means it has been designed and analysed to show that there is no single point of failure in the device that can cause it to cease to operate. And secondly, that it will have alarms that will indicate that a failure has occurred, and that includes failures before the device actually stops operating. So you can do something about it before the failure occurs. So it's quite reasonable to say, well, that will reduce risk to a much lower, that would reduce the probability of occurrence of the failure to a much lower level. See, I'm running out of time here, so I must pedal fast. So protective measures. So independent patient vital sign monitoring in the intensive care is a protective measure, a secondary mechanism of determining the problem. And you train your ICU staff that if the ventilator fails and the alarms go off, then you apply manual ventilation whilst you replace the failed equipment or restore its operation. And the information for safety flavour is instructions in relation to the patient. So the end of that is we judge by the probabilities having been reduced that the overall probability of the failure of the device is dramatically reduced, and also the probability that failure of the device will lead to the death of the patient is dramatically reduced. So we end up with a resultant lower probability, a lower overall probability, and a lower risk score, leading to the risk being acceptable. I might go a little bit over here, Tim, just so I can do a couple more. So just a real quick one, the patient's state of mind, and I won't go through the detail of this, but the patient being fitted with the mask suffers anxiety. So you say, well, that's comes up as an unacceptable score because the probability of that's extremely high. And you say, well, what can we do about it? We can say, prepare the patient by warning them or advising them about that the treatment, that the mask is for their own benefit. They're still probably going to be anxious because they're going to think they're getting sicker. But the physician might recommend sedation. So the patient's given some sedation before the step is taken to apply the mask. But at the end of the day, we say, well, even if we do all those things, the patient's still probably going to be anxious. Even if you do all these things, you'll still have a substantial probability that a substantial number of patients are going to be anxious. So therefore, you're left with a risk of anxiety. It's a very low harm severity, but nevertheless, the risk is still unacceptably high. And so risk-benefit analysis says, well, the risk of providing ventilation support that may save the patient's life ultimately is far in excess of the harm caused to the patient by them being anxious. So we can flick back and have a look at a couple of these other ones if anyone's particularly interested, but we'll have a look at an electrical one. So a sequence of events: catastrophic electrical failure causes conductive surfaces of the device to become live, and that can expose the operator to dangerous voltage that can cause a fatal electric shock. So the probability of that happening for any electrical device that's been sensibly designed is quite low, but because the outcome is catastrophic, then we still end up with an unacceptably high risk if we were to design the device just to normal industry standards. So I made the note, industry standard practices to use electrical insulation isolation between voltages. Then we have a look at 60601-1. So it prescribes electrical isolation using two means of patient protection. So if you achieve that and prove that you've achieved 2 means of patient protection, 60601-1 has deemed you to have reduced risk to an acceptably low level. And so by having this 2 means of patient protection, we say the risk of the electrification of the device is extremely low, and we then end up with an acceptable level of risk as a consequence of the application of 60601-1.
So Geoff, when you have all these figures like 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000, how do you source those numbers?
The preferred way is to source those numbers from some actual numerical data. And you can often do that in cases where there have been analyses. For example, there's analyses of the risk of electric shock causing death, that you can get some actual numbers that relate to real world data. However, in the vast majority of cases, you're going to have to make a sensible estimation of that. And that's done by consulting with experts in the field who have some experience. If you can look up data for devices or predicate devices, and there is actually data about their use and adverse events that have occurred, you can actually look through that and you can justify your probability estimates by real world experience of similar devices, and that is sometimes available. But quite often you really just have to put, it's better than an educated guess. It has to be a justified number. Err on the side in these unmitigated risks, or on the side of making them higher rather than lower. And then when you have applied a protective measure, you just have to make a sensible judgment that if I apply what the standard says I should do, then that is going to dramatically reduce the risk of the hazardous situation or reduce the harm. And a really good example of that, I've got the one up there, the one I had at the start, going from a device that fails and nothing happens to having a device that's got an alarm that says it's failed, that's got no single point of failure, so it doesn't fail, it's not likely to fail in the first place, then having a secondary bit of equipment monitoring the patient's well-being, their blood oxygenation level, for example, also with its own independent alarms, you can argue that that will reduce the likelihood of a failure that's not dealt with to an incredibly low level, an infinitesimally small probability that all those things would go wrong all at once, leading to the patient dying. Then you've got to take in, you mentioned your human factors. Take, for example, I'll skip down to one. Here's a good example. Well, I've talked about having a backup battery. You have a scenario we've got an overstressed ICU full of COVID patients, including people not normally in the ICU, so the staff are really stressed and they're spread thin. Then the hospital power fails and the backup generator doesn't cut in. You can imagine chaos, all hell will break loose, and there's probably not sufficient staff there to manually ventilate all the intubated patients. So you do have a really heavy human input to the worst case scenario in that situation. So in this instance, we are saying that the protective measure that we're including is a backup battery that can run the device for sufficient time to allow the hospital power to be restored. And you might say, well, how often does a hospital backup generator not kick in? Well, that's actually happened, where the generators have tripped when they've tried to kick in, and there's need to be manual intervention to restore the mains power to the hospital by getting the generators online. And so all the life support equipment had to fall back to its batteries during that scenario. So that can happen. And then, of course, you've put your protective measure of your battery in place. So what's the probability that the battery is actually going to be charged and work properly? So you have to take into account the fact that your protective measure may not be 100% effective. So you still have some residual risk resulting from that. So it's a long-winded answer to your question, Tim, but getting these probabilities right, or when I say right, plausible and believable is probably the biggest challenge in this. Most of the rest of it can be done pretty systematically, but getting those probabilities right is the hardest thing. And the recourse is, if you really can't sensibly estimate the unmitigated probability, or the probabilities before the risk control is applied, just put them in at the highest end of your wild ass guess and see what happens with that, and then make sure that you have sufficient risk control measures to deal with it. That might often mean more than one measure. You can see that in this instance we've got inclusion of a backup battery, and that backup battery will itself have single point of failure avoidance, so it will have self-test and monitoring on it to make sure the battery is in a fit state to power the device when it's needed. So you have this layered approach to reducing the risk.
Now we should start wrapping up, and we do have another question that actually talks to what next. And that question is, what is your process for tracing requirements back to your hazards analysis? Do you simply reference your hazard ID in the requirements, or vice versa?
There's a couple of flavors to that. In fact, there's several flavors to that. For the broad requirements, for the broad category of risks that are not specifically identified in the standards, it is by traceability back to ultimately the design inputs and the user needs. The risk will be associated with that requirement and need, so you can trace back by that method. But there are a couple of other specific aspects. 60601-1 throughout the standard clauses identify specific risks and hazards. So I include in this table, it's not shown in the simplified version, but I actually have a column in this table that identifies the 60601-1 clause that relates to that particular hazard or sequence of events, or parameter aspect of a device that's relevant to that sequence of events. Link that to 60601 clause in this table, and in the 60601 clause applicability analysis table, I link it back into the hazard ID. So I do the linkage both ways. So when you're looking at the risk management, you can find the 60601-1 clauses that are addressed, and when you're looking at 60601-1 compliance, you can then identify the hazards that have been analysed in relation to that aspect. Of course, the same applies to usability, and the same applies to software. There's another category of requirements that arise where you have a risk control measure. That risk control measure is defined in the requirements, the design input specification. So the design input specification will have a functional requirement that deals with that risk control measure. Approach we use is we actually identify that with its identifying code so it's traceability code. We have a special code for risk control measures. So they have an RCM appendix to their identifying code that says this is a risk control measure, because we know that we need to link risk control measures back into the hazards analysis, and we need to take special verification and validation processes to show that the risk control measure is effective. But that's a whole nother discussion. How do you actually show that you demonstrate your risk control measures?
It sounds like we might need another webinar on that, Geoff. It's very hard to visualize that when you're just talking to it, but thanks for answering that.
And I also say when we're talking about medical devices and what is the linchpin that holds everything together, and a pretty good answer to that is the risk management and hazards analysis. You can actually use this as the core from which everything else stems and all ultimately links back. If you're ever in doubt about what you need to do in terms of functional requirements or verification and validation, a pretty good answer is, what does your risk management say? And if your risk management doesn't tell you, then it means you've got a deficiency in your risk management process.
Excellent. Have you got much more to present, Geoff? Or
no, that's it. I'll zoom back to the.
If you could just get back to the other slides.
Sorry, everyone. That's been pretty heavy duty, but as Tim indicated, we've gone a bit deeper than scratching the surface, but we haven't turned over all the stones by any means. But that's the nature of the beast.
And